Thank you, dear audience. My name is Dr. Mahul Brahma, and I am with Shelley Spector. And so I look forward to a great chat with Shelley. Such an interesting concept of the PR museum that she has started. So welcome, Shelley, on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, pleasure. So we'll get on with the questions. So the first question, Shelley, is on your favorite topic. So on the PR museum. So my question is, how did this idea come about? And for the audience, you've already seen the video on the PR museum, so you have some idea of what it is on, I think, December 30th when it was played. So the question to you, Shelley, is how did this idea come about? And please share with the audience the story of it, because PR museum is such a fantastic idea. And also adding to that, I know that you are trying to digitize the entire content, and which is a fantastic way forward, because it takes the museum to our homes. So which is a fantastic effort. And so I would like to ask you that what kind of support do you need from the PR and comms fraternity, because you are doing us such a wonderful favor, and bringing in the history of our profession to our doorsteps. So over to you, Shelley.
Well, for the digitization, we can thank COVID for that, because we had a steady stream of visitors for years and years and years. And they would come in and look at the materials. I would give guest lectures. We would have in-person events. And that was revenue generating for the museum. It kept us operating, paying the rent, paying the light bills. And with COVID, everything shut down right away. And we decided first, well, how is everybody going to see this, right? We have all this great stuff here. Students around the world can't take a look at it anymore. So we decided, okay, we're going to have to digitize. But that takes money. That takes buying different kinds of scanners. And so we've been working on this for a few months. We need the help of the worldwide public relations industry. We really do. We can't do it on our own. So we have a GoFundMe page set up. And so if you go to GoFundMe and you type in PR Museum, you'll find that we have it set up. You can even send us a check. We'd appreciate it. And the address would be Museum of PR, 85 Broad Street, New York, New York, 10004. But the story of how the museum got started, it wasn't our idea, believe it or not. This was Bernays's idea. And yeah, it was Bernays's idea to start a museum of public relations. And my husband and I were there. We had been going there about 10 years. We would go up, videotape him 3-4 times a year. And eventually, we would bring our babies up there, or who grew up thinking that Eddie was actually their third grandfather. That's how close we were. And every time we would go up, we would create oral histories with him. And sometimes we just leave the camera running on a tripod. So we have hours and hours and hours of footage, and you saw some of that in the documentary. We got to know him by accident in 1985, and then we would start going up there when we realized, my God, this guy knew everybody in the 20th century, all the VIPs, all the presidents, the movie stars, the corporations at the time. And of course, his double uncle is Sigmund Freud, right? So he was just so interesting in how he created the programs that he did. So you never got bored listening to him. And of course, he would talk for hours on end. Remember, this guy, when we met him, was 94, right? And so when he was about 101, I asked him, what are you going to do with all this stuff in the house? He said, I'd like to create a museum of public relations. And I said, I don't think that's going to be possible. People aren't going to want to come up to Cambridge, Massachusetts to have a museum or to go to see a museum. He said, well, then would you and Barry create a museum of public relations in New York? And we just said, sure, without thinking it through. We're public relations people, and doing a museum was not something that we ever thought of doing. So, but here was an opportunity handed to us. And one thing I've learned in life is not to say no, but just go for it.
Right. And it's amazing that at that age, even at that age, he thinks of how he can contribute to the greater fraternity. It's amazing. For Barney, it's like hats off.
I think, Bernays had lots and lots of brilliant ideas, but I think this one was the most brilliant. It really was, because it permitted the whole world to see PR history right up close, and to understand the importance of public relations in making history. So the museum is not just to record or to visualize the history of the profession, which is a century old, right? If you go back to Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays, but how the profession has impacted the history of culture, politics, fashion, entertainment, all sorts of things. So we're really educating the world on what public relations is and what it can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful. So that brings me to my second question. So, what makes it difficult to create the type of time agnostic campaigns that Edward Bernays and Lee created a century ago? So you were talking about some of the campaigns. It's amazing, mind blowing, and I just what are the challenges in today's world to recreate that kind of a campaign?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is that back then, public relations was so new. He was behind the scenes. Nobody said, oh, that's a PR campaign for Lucky Strikes or a beach nut packing company. Nobody realized what was going on, right? It was a kind of spontaneous event or a survey that he was doing. Today, with so many people around the world pitching stories to reporters, right? There's a lot of competition. Even though back then you had far more newspapers than exist today, right? But today we have so many social media outlets. So I think it's kind of, what's going on is that for the first 80 years of public relations, most of the people who were practicing were former newspaper people. So creating a newsworthy story was second nature to them. Well, with social media, it's not the way anymore. People, students, especially the students I teach, will go immediately to social media. If you're talking about placing a story, it's not like you and I had learned where you had to come up with a news angle, right? You had to pick something that was relevant, topical. I find that a lot of kids today are just go right to social media to place a story. And it's not the same kind of thing. Because if you're placing a story with a newspaper editor, he's going to want the story to be newsworthy, non-promotional, right? So you have to really be diligent in knowing the stories that are out there and how you could make your client part of that story that's out there.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that brings me to my third question. So please share some stories of these PR personalities like Barney's, because we need to know about them and who has been inspiring communicators for ages, but not it's not out in the public forum to that extent, to which extent Barney's has gotten exposure, like Lee and the other greats of that time. So we would like to hear those stories and about those great personalities who have framed what we are enjoying today a century ago.
So who were the greats from back then, the early days?
Absolutely.
Of course, we have Bernays, and he's probably the most famous because he lived the longest, right? He lived until he was 103 and a half, and he did a lot of writing, did a lot of books. Ivy Lee was there before him. Now, right. While Bernays was focused mostly on, I would say, marketing, public relations, who typically consumer, right? Ivy Lee created the whole idea of crisis public relations without calling it crisis public relations, but he had to deal with one crisis at a time working for the Rockefeller family, right? He was the first one to issue a press release, which he did. And that was one of the most astounding things in PR history is Ivy Lee, who was a New York Times reporter himself before he got into the business of PR, he was handling the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, had a derailment in 1904. And back then, companies, CEOs did not want to talk about accidents, derailments, right? How many people died or got hurt. They felt it was much better to keep it all quiet. But Ivy Lee said, well, the press are going to find out about it anyway. Isn't it better to tell the story from our point of view, right? To get that message out there, what really happened. And so he issued what he called a statement to the press, which eventually became a press release.
And called a statement to the press.
And yeah, statement to the press, went on the first page of the New York Times, quoted him directly, because, and the reason that they quoted him directly, it was non-promotional, it didn't sound offensive, it was, here's the news, here's what happened today. And that was the first time that the press took the company's word for what was going on. And from then on, you know, became standard practice, except Bernays himself never used a press release. Then you started having in-house corporate communications people. And the first one was Arthur Page for AT&T. And, you know, he was, again, a journalist, and he had some very wise things to say about this business. And one of the things that he said that is very much on our minds today is that a corporation cannot act unless it has the permission of the public. And so the company has to behave in a way that the public, which, you know, the shareholders, the communities, and even employees are amenable to. So they may have to change what the company is doing, its own behavior. And so he was the first high-level corporate. He wasn't called a CCO back then, he was VP of PR. Soon after that came Paul Garrett, who became the CCO or VP of Public Relations for the General Motors Company. And again, he would, and realized that the context of the time here, these people were in public relations right around the time of the Depression, the beginning of the Depression, right? So one interesting thing that Paul Garrett did was he decided, well, people aren't going to be buying cars during the Depression. Why not use this time to create a feeling of trust and goodwill between General Motors and the public, so that when this depression is over, they'll be ready to buy cars. And so he set up these buses called Futurama, and inside they would show these science experiments and, you know, the world of the future. We're going to have video phones one day, you know. This was how people in the early 1930s would think about what the future is. And he gave people hope. So these buses were traveling all over the United States in these small towns, and especially in the towns where they already had a dealership for GM cars. And so he would involve the salesman too. So this was a time of where a corporation, it was the first time you had a corporation reaching out on the local level, not for sales, right, but to create goodwill, to lay the foundation so that later they can have sales. And I'm sorry, what?
No, that's a very visionary thought process. I mean, which is very rare. You know,
it is
on the Depression and how to you know, sell hope and create the connect. Use the Depression and create the connect so that you have a ready market, ready demand.
Especially because none of the competing companies were doing that, like Ford.
Right.
So GM had, if you look at the sales of General Motors in the late part of the Depression, you see that they had many more sales around the country than did Ford. So it makes a great case for corporate communications. During the 30s was a fascinating time, by the way. You would think that public relations was not doing anything because who could afford public relations during the Depression? Well, what happened was companies realized, just like Paul Garrett, that people weren't buying products. They took all their money that they had put into advertising and put it into public relations. And so if they weren't going to buy products, then let's build up the reputations of the corporations, and that's what they did. Now, the second wave of growth, of course, was after World War II. During World War II, we had a number of people whose names you may have heard of, like Al Golan, Dan Edelman, people that, Fleischman and Hillard, people who eventually became extremely successful public relations men because they had been working during the war in writing. Harold Burson himself was a court reporter during the Nuremberg trials. So these men who had gone into the armed forces for the United States, who went in with a writing ability, came out founding public relations agencies. So that was the second wave of public relations agencies in the late 40s, early 50s.
Early 50s, yeah. Wonderful. Wow. I thought I'll take the questions later, but there are two very relevant questions which I would now take from the audience. That will keep the flow of the conversation afoot. So one question is from Radhika Nandwani. So she's asking that other than Edward Bernays, can you recall some women in this profession who are pioneers?
That's my favorite topic, because in all the textbooks, they only talk about white men, right? Let's remember the first woman, the mother of public relations, was married to the father of public relations, right, who was Bernays. Doris Fleischman Bernays was an unbelievably good writer. She was behind the scenes, though, because back then women were not allowed into client meetings. But it was she herself who did so much of the writing for the clients and came up with the ideas. And then there were women along the way that were just not mentioned in the history books. We had the first Black woman to open a PR firm in 1957 in Kansas, which is something you'd never expect. And her name is Inez Kaiser. Just this month, we're coming out with a chapter on her and a book on women PR leaders through the years. Now, I think the most important, most influential public relations person of late is a woman named Marilyn Laurie, who started working at AT&T early 1970s. And she eventually, without having any formal learning in public relations, eventually became the CCO of AT&T. And she was in charge of 1 million employees around the world, 1 million, in charge of IR, employee communications, just everything, and had access to the CEO, right? She's so interesting. The museum published a book about her this past year, which is available certainly by going online. You could buy it through Amazon, you could buy it through the museum. We use this book in the classroom because through the first-hand accounts of Marilyn Laurie, you can learn about crisis, you could learn about leadership, you could learn about creativity, big ideas. So she was my direct inspiration when I was starting out in this business.
That's fantastic. So another question, which is also relevant to what we are discussing at this point, is from Roshan Alexander, who has asked that, do you have any modern PR leader who reminds you of Edward Bernays?
I'd say there is no single person who has, that I'm aware of, all the attributes that Bernays had. I'd say as far as creativity, coming up with big concepts, it would be Marilyn Laurie. As far as the intellectualism and his influence outside of PR itself would be Richard Edelman, hands down. Richard Edelman, who's now the head of the Edelman Agency. And there's another fellow whose name is Fred Garcia, who is highly influential outside of the PR industry too. In the same ways that Bernays was not just stuck in the world of public relations, because there was no really an industry back then, but he would be called upon for comment about things going on in the world, in the same way that Fred Garcia is today and Richard Edelman is today. And of course, one of the most brilliant things that Richard Edelman did was he created the trust barometer. And through that, he attaches his firm with the idea of building trust, which is really at the foundation of what we do.
Absolutely, that's the core, and we sometimes don't remember that. So my next question is, for us communicators and for the young lot who are starting out, can you share the most important lesson that you think we can learn from Barnes? 2 or 3 as you want to share for us and for the young lot.
When you look at Bernays' interviews that we did with him in the 1980s, we ask him to explain a campaign. He always starts off with, we did a research. Because it sounds funny, but that's what they called it. We did a research. Research was always the first thing he did, whether it was qualitative research by talking to psychologists, which he did a lot, especially for the Torches of Freedom campaign. Why do women smoke cigarettes? He did quantitative research. And it was the first quantitative opinion poll ever done. And this was done for the Beechnut Packing Company for the Bacon and Eggs campaign. So he would never create a campaign unless he had the research first. So I think that that's number one. Number two is to read the news, is to know what's going on. I used to teach a class, part of it was teaching students how to fold the New York Times, because they would make an excuse, oh, it's too big, I can't read it on the subway. So we'd have several sessions. In fact, I would give them a midterm on how to fold a newspaper, because it was that important. This was before we had the newspaper on our phones. But I think that today, because the people in the business are no longer journalists, the idea of news is not as relevant as it used to be to them. And that's a shift that I don't like to see. News is extremely important because you can't create publicity unless you know what's going out there, right? And I can give some examples of where putting out a story, for instance, this would be a particularly bad week to talk about the, architecture of the Capitol building, and because of what happened earlier this week. So you have to be aware of the sensitivity of the public and what are the trends that are going on now, because it's then much easier to tie into those trends that the newspaper reporters are writing about. Right. And the third thing is to think about big ideas. Look at Bernays' ideas and look at Marilyn Laurie's ideas as inspiration for creating your own big ideas. And big ideas, as we like to define them, are attached to a social cause, are newsworthy, right? They're topical, they create trends, they will make news. And that's an extraordinarily important concept now, making news, generating news. So when you're doing an idea, whether for a big corporation or even a smallest corporation, you need to make news get out there with a very important issue, a social cause that the public will care about.
Wonderful, wonderful. I come from a newspaper background. I was associated with the India partner of New York Times, and I can understand what you're talking about, especially the fold part. People don't realize how critical it is, how you fold a newspaper when you read. And so you place the story accordingly. So so for a news editor, it's very important to understand the fold, to get into the reader's mindset and see what will he read first and second, what will hit his eye first and second. So you place your story accordingly. And for a PR person also, it's very important that, to understand that, so that there is a relevance, there is a neural coupling between the demand and the supply, the demand of the editor and the supply of the PR person. So there is a connect.
Exactly.
So I can completely understand where you're coming from. So, exactly. Very, very wonderful points and lessons from Edward Barnes. So moving on to my next question. So the world has changed, and how would you think that Barnets have reacted to the misinformation age filled with fake news that you see going around today?
Well, I think first Bernays would say there's no such thing as fake news. It's just a lie. You know, news is by definition is truthful, right? So he would talk about the big lie. He would talk about, he would analyze what's been going on, at least in this country over the past 4 years, and compare it to Goebbels, Mussolini, dictators who could just say anything that they want. And he would think that the press abdicated their responsibility to find out if a story is true or not. A lot of news organizations, we always have assumed that news organizations are going to tell us the way it is, tell us the truth. That's the way it used to be. But suddenly, over the past 10 years or so, at least in the US, we have a bunch of news organizations that are not telling you the absolute truth, that have a spin on it to make you think a certain way. And that's been extremely harmful to, and extremely bad for the psyche of this country, because now you have half of the country who believe one thing. We don't believe in a common set of facts. How can you have a democracy if half the country thinks one thing and half the country thinks another? And no better illustration of it than this week at the US Capitol.
Yes, yes. It's unfortunate, but that's what it is leading to. But tell me one thing. One of the key tenets of Barney's campaigns was that you should not use the brand's name. You should go with the social message, and then the brand's name will come as an effect of the message. Once the message is reached its target audience, then the brand will come. Do you think in today's world where everybody is into a name game business, they are shouting their names, and that's the first thing that you see, is it still possible to have that ethos into campaigns?
I do think it's possible. You have to do an integrated campaign, though, between social media, advertising, and public relations. In straight public relations, you really should not be talking about the company because it sounds too commercial and promotional, right? Yes. Reporters will get turned off to that, as you know, right? And as from your own experience, right? But you can support the campaign with advertising or paid social media. So everybody knows who is responsible for creating this big issue. So as long as you have a campaign that involves people for marketing, advertising, social media, and public relations, and if the public relations people have the upper hand in creating the messaging, making sure it doesn't get too promotional, right? Then you have a shot at it. Back in Bernays, as I mentioned earlier, nobody knew who was behind these campaigns. They didn't even look at them as campaigns. Suddenly there's a story in the New York Times about eating bacon and eggs. And you had an endorsement from 4,500 physicians around the country saying that's a good thing. Nowhere in there does it say Beach Nut Packing Company, or does it say that Bernays created it. Today, it's a little more difficult to do that. But I do want to point out that so much of today is reliant upon social media in being promotional and trying to tell the company's message that way. But what you're doing is you're losing the credibility that you can only get from third-party endorsement, which is the news.
Absolutely. That's the difference between a news and an advertisement. So, that's a line that we should, keep alive as long as possible.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, keep alive as long as possible. So, you said the way social media has been impacting PR and communications in today's world. So, do you think that technology has had a very significant impact on the way PR is done today, or the campaigns are executed today? Technology per se?
I think if used in the right way, it's been very helpful. I still like to go back to the foundations of public relations, and because it's not taught anymore. And I think it's gone overboard for the sake of the students understanding what public relations really is about. So when they used to come to our museum, the museum is set up like a Bernays' office 100 years ago. So we have a candlestick phone, we have a manual typewriter, we have an old desk, we have an inbox, so that they can see 100 years ago how people back then, men and women, practiced public relations. We're looking to get also a teletype machine, an AP teletype machine, so they can see, how the news came across to PR offices. It's very, very important, I think, for students to learn those fundamentals where you didn't have social media, so you had to rely on having big newsworthy ideas in order to get your story out there. And that's how we were trained. If you were, I was trained as a journalist myself, and in the early days, a couple of decades, we didn't have social media. If you wanted to place a story, it was a matter of creating news, and you probably knew the editors. You pointed out before, because you're reading the paper, you can say to the editor, hey, you wrote this story 2 weeks ago. I thought you would find this interesting. But today, the level of credibility that reporters have for PR people may be diminished because people are just being a little too commercial and promotional about what they're up to.
Yes. There is also a thing that it is your responsibility as a PR person to educate your own management. Yeah. To make them understand what makes news and what will increase the credibility of the brand and what will not. If you are able to make that clear statement with your management, what you take to the journalist or the editors, that quality, is very different than what you take otherwise. Because to the management, they'll want everything out. They'll want everything to be published. But not everything makes news. What makes news in the internal journal, internal office journal, will not be making news at New York Times or in the Economic Times or on the big newspaper. So that, I think, is the responsibility of the PR person as well, to educate the management in terms of what to expect and what will make news. So that increases the credibility of the PR person in the eyes of the editors as well.
You're absolutely right.
Yes. Even in the terms of social media, you have to use it as per building credibility and not give everything that is happening in the company, pour it on the social media, so that somebody who's trying to understand the company through the social media will not have any, idea of what you're trying to, the message that you're trying to put across. They'll see everything, and which is not leading to any brand building. It just says that I'm providing you with information. Please have it.
I think a big part of our responsibility as PR people is to educate what it can and cannot do. And you're right. So many times the CEO says, hey, we just hired a new sales manager. Get the story in the New York Times. Many years ago, 1938, there was a publication, a trade publication called Public Relations. And it contained in there a hierarchy of where public relations stands in a corporation. So you have the chairman, CEO, and right under that, you had public relations director. Several level downs, you have marketing and advertising. So back then, the public relations person was looked at as a counselor to the CEO.
Absolutely.
Not so much anymore.
Absolutely. You're absolutely spot on. And I think because the PR person or the comms person has a bird's eye view, which the department heads may not have, because they are too focused into the business. They are not able to look at the bird's eye view, and that's why the CEO or MD needs to keep them close to understand the overall organizational perspective rather than getting into the departmental perspective.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful. Absolutely. So before I let you go, for the young aspirants of in this communications and PR field, what will be your one advice from Barney's and from Shelley?
I'd say the one piece of advice is to read the news, to know what's going on every day, to understand who's writing what, to understand the current events, the attitudes, understand the attitudes of a public right now, all the different sides of what makes public opinion. Public opinion is not one thing anymore. There's some major divergent public opinions out there. We as public relations people need to understand what those public opinions, what those attitudes are, translate that to the CEO, and be the kind of broker between the public and the corporation.
Yes, yes. That's a wonderful piece of advice, and thanks so much, Shelley. So thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. And I am an ardent reader of the Digital PR Museum, so I have read several articles there, and it's been extremely educational. And thanks to you for curating it, because I never thought I'll see those newspaper cuttings which are, a century old. This is amazing. So I wish you all the best, and the entire fraternity in India and abroad will be supporting you towards your endeavor in digitizing it and taking the PR museum to their homes. And I wish in the future we should have local versions of PR museums in other countries as well, so that there's a curation happening at that level as well.
I hope
thank you so much. Thank you, Shelley, for being there. Thanks to the audience, and thanks Reputation today for organizing SPECTRA. It's a great conversation that I had. Please take care and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.